Right. So, welcome. I am very excited to have Amy Mariaskin here. Amy has lots of accolades that I'm going to go through. I won't embarrass her too much, maybe just a little. So, Amy is the founder and owner of, in addition to running this wonderful treatment center. She's an amazing therapist who specializes in treating anxiety and OCD and all of the related things. Um, Amy is also the relationships with OCD. I got that right. Yeah.
Honestly, my internet cut out twice when you were doing this. It saved me from being embarrassed, but it's thriving in relationships when you have OCD, if that's what you
When you
said.
have OCD, I've missed the when you have. That was it. But it's an awesome book. I recommend it. What else? Amy is also faculty for IOCDF. She facilitates some of those consultation groups and does training for IOCDF. So she is a master of all things OCD. I will also note, so we're very happy to have her as part of the North Carolina lecture series. And I'll also put in a plug that she is a wonderful human being and friend, and we're very thankful to have her. So, Amy, take it away. I will be quiet now.
All righty. Sweet. Well, as you were speaking and my internet was doing its like little weird dance, I was preoccupied with whether or not I was caught in making a funny face. And then I also somehow made it so that I can't see my slides. So I'm going to try to, yeah, I'm just trying to make everybody feel comfortable by messing up. Um,
I mean,
gallery.
do you want to unshare and then share them again? Will that help?
Yeah,
I
it's
feel
like
like
you're
the like turn it on, turn it off solution is usually
exactly. Yeah, let me do that. Stop share. Share. And just share this. Just share it. Why not? Yeah. Okay, I can see it. Can you guys see it? Yeah, you can see it. Okay. Awesome. I'm so excited to be here today and to talk about something that's so important to me, which is effective treatment for people in the LGBTQIA plus community. And I think we're going through a really cool time in the OCD world in particular, in starting to increasingly consider how people's intersecting identities might influence their experience of treatment, their accessibility of treatment, their expression of symptoms, and more. So we're seeing this for people in this community. We're seeing this for people of other marginalized communities. We're seeing this for people with varying ethnic identities, racial identities, et cetera. And what I'm going to do is try to make this as relevant as possible for therapists, for people with lived experience, because I know, or parents, I'm not sure who's here, but I'll kind of touch on a number of different things. And when, not if, but when my internet goes out again and I freeze, Ben has said that he will come on and yell at me. So love that. Love that like anxiety that I get to feel. Okay. So, and I have until this is an hour, right? So like 45 minutes maybe, and then some questions. I'll try to save like 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. But here's what I'd like to be talking about tonight. Number one, I just want to talk about OCD in the LGBTQIA plus community. I will, just for the sake of not saying all of those letters each time, I might also say the queer community, I might say the LGBT community, I might say people of sexual and gender minority status. So you'll hear me kind of mix it up. But I do want to talk about that, prevalence rates, symptoms, et cetera. And then special considerations for treatment. What are the things that we can do to ensure that we are meeting the needs of people in this community when they're coming in for OCD treatment? How are we altering things to make sure that not only their needs are being met, but also we're not perpetuating harmful stereotypes or stigma about the queer community in the treatment that we're giving? And then After that, I'm going to briefly talk about finding competent and affirming care, and this can be quite difficult. I am in Tennessee. I know that many of you are in North Carolina. And depending on where you are in the state, it can be really difficult in either of those states and in many states in the US. It can be difficult to find people who are not only affirming, but also have the level of competence so that you don't feel like you're providing your therapist with education. And then we'll get to Q&A. Okay, so a little bit about me. I really wanted to talk about, like the lenses through which I see this. And so number one, I've been a clinician for many more years than I care to admit. I'm actually, I'm sort of an honorary North Carolinian. I think I went to grad school at Duke. I was there for so many years. So many years. Dissertations are hard. I stayed a long time. But anyway, I realized the other day, like how long ago it's been that I graduated. And so I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been working with people across the lifespan. This includes kiddos, teens, adults, older adults, couples, families. And that has really informed my lens here. I'm also a supervisor, and I think that supervising newer clinicians, many of whom are either new to working with OCD, new to working with the queer community, or both, has really shown me some of those areas where therapists might have blind spots and might benefit from a little bit of support around how you can best work with this community. I'm also a business owner in the South. And so one of the lenses that I have as well is thinking about where you are doing business, what legislation is going on, how do you kind of make sure that your practice, if you're a solo practitioner or a group practitioner, how are you really messaging to your community that you're a safe place? In particular, if you're living in an area that has that has a lot of anti-LGBTQIA plus legislation. And then I also have lived experience. So I have lived experience both as somebody with OCD and as somebody in the queer community. So those are my lenses. So I want to talk about, before we really talk about OCD in the community, I want to talk about just mental health concerns in the queer community. And so this is a lot. I don't necessarily have to go through all of this, but these are statistics from the US Department of Health and Human Services, the Trevor Project, which is really looking at queer youth, and then the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. So pretty jarring here. So 20 to 30% of people in the community have a diagnosed substance use disorder, compared to about 9% of people who are not in the LGBTQIA community. Adults are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their non-sexual and gender minority counterparts, and youth 4 times more likely. Okay, we have issues with accessibility as well. Over half of LGBTQ young people who wanted mental health care were not able to access it. And bisexual females were 3 times more likely than straight females to have had an opioid use disorder, as well as the prevalence of serious mental illness. So mental illness that's really debilitating. Again, we're seeing multitudes of times more likely amongst certain populations. So bisexual males 3 times higher, gay males twice as high. So not OCD specific, right? And then when you get to OCD, this floored me. Look at this. For people in the community, LGBTQ plus people are 4 to 9 times more likely to present with OCD than their counterparts who are not in the community. And this is something, again, we need more research here, but again, the fact that the low estimate is 4 times more likely is pretty jarring. And what that means is that with prevalence rates this high, if you're a therapist, you are likely to have queer clients on your caseload. If you don't, might be time to kind of step back and think, oh, well, do I have a practice that is safe enough for people to want to come and get therapy from me? Or are there people who are not disclosing this because they don't feel safe? Because it's, these are high prevalence rates. Okay. we could have a whole lecture about this, but why are rates higher? There is something called the minority stress model, and this has been out for a long time, but it's really systemic, interpersonal, and internal factors all coalescing to come together and create some of these disparities in rates. And so when you're looking at the queer community, there are socioeconomic and health disparities, so more likely to be uninsured or underinsured, to be living in poverty, to have poor access to health care. There's also, of course, discrimination, stigma, and bias, particularly for trans people of color. So when you look again at those kind of intersecting identities, you're going to see more of an impact of marginalized identity on rates of mental health concerns, et cetera, or at least rates of stress. And the theory is higher rates of stress, higher rates of mental health concerns. Also, there's some really cool research recently looking at the links between trauma and OCD, and Dr. Caitlin Pinciotti, whose name is like all over this because she does the trauma work as well as work on OCD in the queer community. Higher rates of trauma in the queer community may also influence subsequent development of OCD. And then, of course, there's internalized shame and stigma. And so all of that coming together can influence higher rates of mental health concerns. And when it comes to OCD, again, this is a pretty profound impact. If we look at symptom presentation, people in the community experience all symptoms of OCD. I think that sort of goes without saying, but I like to say that first because I think it's important when we're highlighting differences, we're also highlighting what is the same. And so OCD is OCD is OCD. However, some research has shown that taboo thoughts may be especially prevalent, and that includes taboo sexual thoughts, violent thoughts, thoughts about religion or blasphemy. So there may be some differences in this population where those rates are higher relative to what they are in different populations. And then despite having limited representation in the literature, people of sexual and gender minority status can have sexual orientation OCD and gender-related OCD as well. And I'm hoping that most of you who are clinicians kind of already know this, but I think for many years when we talked about sexual orientation OCD, it was, which makes sense. There's a lot of straight people. It was a lot of like, I'm straight and like, what if I'm gay or what if I'm bi? That was kind of always the representation that was out there. And so but it happens across people of all gender identities and all sexual orientations. So what if I'm not actually trans or non-binary and I just want attention? I think I highlight that one in particular because it shows how sometimes OCD symptoms can almost like appropriate stereotypes that are out there or, beliefs that are out there, bigoted beliefs. What if I'm straight or I'm bi and I've been living a lie as somebody who's identified as gay or lesbian? What if I actually have sexual or romantic attraction to others and I'm not truly asexual? And just like any other OCD, it can sort of find quote unquote evidence anywhere. So while I had I've identified as asexual, but I saw a picture of an attractive person and I had a groinal response. Does that mean that I'm not asexual, right? So, if you work with OCD and you probably recognize those symptoms, but maybe if you're not working with the queer community, you're not aware of like what it looks like for people in the community. Certainly LGBTQIA plus people of faith may have unique challenges based on if, and this again is not all faiths by any means, but if there are some questions from faith leaders about whether or not the identity itself is sinful or wrong, or if this behavior is wrong. And so when you're working with people in the community who also are practicing, have religious beliefs, then that maybe also present a unique challenge. In terms of treatment trajectory, there have been no differences. There were two studies. Interestingly, they were both looking at more intensive treatment. So looking at like PHP, IOP, and residential level care. And there were no differences in either severity at onset, so symptom severity or treatment outcome. So these people coming from this community were no more kind of like initially elevated in symptoms, nor did they have poorer treatment outcomes. And this is great news, right? Because it means that that the treatment that we know that's evidence-based, that works for OCD works just as well in the queer community as it does for others. Okay. So when you're looking at treatment with somebody who is in the queer community, there are a couple of things that I think are really, really important. And this goes for, regardless of the person's age, regardless of, how long they've had OCD. I think sometimes there's a tendency, there's that phrase, is the phrase, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. There's a phrase that like, if you're, and it's like, if you're an OCD therapist, everything can look like OCD. Every expression of anxiety can look like unrealistic, unreasonable anxiety. Every fear can sound like an obsession, and every behavior that's avoidant can seem like a compulsion, or every behavior that seems like it goes above and beyond what is typical. However, for people of all marginalized groups, there may be some ways in which some of this behavior is adaptive and is reasonable. So for example, having increased vigilance may be adaptive. So if you have people in the trans community, and that little plus next to trans is sometimes you'll see that written that way just to show that it's inclusive of people who are gender fluid or gender queer or have other identities that may not sort of fall under the trans umbrella, but they're not just trans man, trans woman. But trans people checking business websites before visiting a business. For somebody who doesn't have a marginalized identity, for somebody who has the privilege to kind of assume like, hey, I can waltz right into this business and I'm not going to have any, discrimination. I will be treated fairly. If you're not considering the perspective that for many people, this is an adaptive behavior, right? That might be something where you say, well, are you going above and beyond? Is this a realistic fear? Queer clients refraining from talking about their partners, something like that might be symptomatic in other contexts, and it might be adaptive for people who are, unsure of who they want to disclose their identity to. Avoidance as well may be motivated by true safety concerns. So there are certain, places. There are certain places that, this is a client talking, my client might say there are certain places I don't feel comfortable going. And I could kind of say like, well, is it, well, I don't feel comfortable going into that particular church. My home church is great. They're very affirming. I don't feel comfortable going into that church. And let's say it's somebody who has like scrupulosity. And I might say, well, I really want you to be able to go and hear all different types of, religious services, because that's going to be really good for your scrupulosity. Well, that's not the point, right? If somebody doesn't feel safe, that's not an appropriate exposure. So certain topics, talking about certain things with people, anything that's going to, result in disclosure, especially if it's disclosure that is not consensual disclosure or things like that. And talking about relationships or avoiding certain relationships, there may be a family member who, let's say, had, recently had COVID. It's somebody with contamination OCD. A family member recently had COVID, and your client says, well, I don't want to see them. I don't want to talk to them. It behooves you not to say, well, oh yeah, it's because you're worried about illness, this and that. It may be that this is a family member who has, said some harmful things. And so a lot of the work as well is helping people sort of creating a safe space so that people can really articulate to you like whether or not this is an OC fear, this is something that's, you know, motivated by preserving safety. Okay. So Dr. Pinciotti is here again. This is I actually think that was 2022. That's the wrong year, but I think it's correct in the references. But in 2022, Caitlin Pinciotti and a number of colleagues wrote this great paper. I think it's called it's call to action, and something about justice-based ERP. But this was really recognizing the ways in which traditional ERP or exposure and response prevention has sometimes done harm, not only to clients, but also to the queer community at large. And so the notion of justice-based ERP is this idea that we want to make sure the treatment isn't harming the therapist, the client, or the community. So it's really this like three-pronged approach. And so making sure that exposures don't perpetuate stereotypes. And I actually have a slide. The next slide is, we'll get into this a little bit, but exposures that don't perpetuate stereotypes or stigma. It used to be that, you know, if somebody was afraid about, they have sexual orientation OCD or something like that, and they're afraid, you know, well, what if people see me and they make an assumption that I'm of a different sexual orientation than I am, then you would really want to lean into like, okay, so let's have you, you know, dress kind of bi or dress kind of gay or what have you. You know, wear a feather boa or something like that if you're a man, and something like that. Again, you might not be even doing these exposures with queer clients, but these are things that are hurting, you know, the LGBTQ community at large and perpetuating stereotypes. You also want to make sure that community members are not subject to harm, so not using people as props. The example that the example I often use is that, you know, if there are worries about being around somebody with, say, like a physical disability, then, you know, an exposure would be, well, go find somebody, or do you know somebody who's like disabled in some way, and can you shake their hand? And like, if you were telling somebody later, oh yeah, that handshake, that was for an exposure, because like they're kind of scared of like catching what you have. Would you want to do that, right? Probably not. And so thinking about this last point here, last bullet point underneath that is, think about if you would have someone do this exposure in front of others from the community. Also keeping queer spaces safe. So, you know, not saying like, hey, let's go to this, you know, let's go to the support group for trans folks. And, you know, I want you to pretend like you're trans and go there and like join the community. I know some of these sound really obvious. I'm trying to use like kind of obvious examples. There are also things that happened, like a lot. And they're part of the reason why I think people sometimes, when they think about your sort of like old school ERP, it's important to recognize like we've come a long way. Also making sure that when you're talking about any symptoms that are related to like sexual orientation or gender, that you're labeling those as identity related OCD and not lumping them in with like taboo and sexual OCD. So lumping in something like a worry that you might have a marginalized, say, queer identity, that's not the same as a worry about like, what if I commit, you know, sexual aggression toward a minor? What if I commit bestiality, right? We want to kind of take this out of the taboo topic and put it more into, so you'll hear this term identity-related OCD. Also, as I mentioned before, OCD can certainly appropriate stereotypes in its content. So a lot of times if you're working with somebody and they identify as bisexual, they might say like, you know, I'm worried, maybe I'm just a greedy person and I'm not really bisexual, or maybe I'm just mentally ill and I just can't make up my mind and I'm not bisexual. That's something that's out there. That's a stereotype that's out there. Predator myths, especially for gay men, but also women, queer women. For a long time, people in the LGBTQ community weren't allowed to serve as like Boy Scout, Girl Scout leaders, right? Because there was this worry, like, well, they're kind of they might be pedophiles, or they might harm children. We don't want children to be subjected to this. So when you have somebody who's has a queer identity and also has something like POCD, they may be having these kinds of they may be having thoughts that are also perpetuated a little bit by these stereotypes, right? And so being able to be affirming to them in their sexuality without adding to these stereotypes. Well, I know, people are telling me that like they don't want me around their kids, and like I wouldn't want me around their kids either. And being able to say like, wow, okay, so the people who are saying that, if they're saying that because of your sexual orientation, wow, that's not evidence for your OCD, right? That's evidence that we have people who don't understand your sexual orientation, period. And so those are some like nuanced conversations that I end up having with my clients who are of queer identities that I don't necessarily have to for people who aren't in the community. And so this justice-based ERP, this is like the most hot off the presses, literally published math 12 days ago, I think, was this article that came out looking at justice-based ERP versus more traditional ERP in a queer population. And justice-based ERP was preferable to traditional ERP. So, and just as effective, I should say that as well. That's really important. So this is something that people want, people respond well to. If they're thinking about like, hey, would I rather do this like semi-offensive exposure, or would I rather do something that's going to get me closer to my values, still be functionally, theoretically sound in terms of ERP? Yeah, I'd rather do the justice-based. Okay, so now again, this is for anyone who has sexual orientation or gender OCD. Again, these may or may not be people in the queer community, but I just thought it's so important to talk about kind of your old school ERP and more helpful ERP. So old school ERP, you would have exposures like dress like you're gay, pretend to come out to someone. Look at images of trans people and talk about how your life would be ruined if you were trans. Go to a bar, hit on a lesbian, just, see how that feels. That's an exposure. Write a script about finding out you're non-binary and it ruining your life. What is wrong with these? So much is wrong with these, but basically these are looking at, they're perpetuating stereotypes, number one. They're harmful to people in the community, right? Like there are, this idea that if my identity is different than the one that I hold now, that's going to change my life. I mean, it's going to change, it would change your life because perhaps you have to, find new partners or new communities, things like that. Hitting on a lesbian, I mean, the idea of going out, like that is a human, that is a person who's being used as a prop, right? So all of those are kind of like, would be considered harmful. And, and they're really actually not even getting at the thing that you want to get at, which is this idea about like, I'm afraid about either being uncertain forever about my identity, or I'm afraid about this sense of inauthenticity. There's almost sort of like using the content a little bit too much. But things that you can do that are kind of more affirming and more helpful: drawing a pride flag, hanging it in your room or your office, watching empowering movies. I always say, again, you want to look at like, what are the things you would be doing if OCD was not interfering? Well, I really like I really like independent movies. And there's this great one, but it's got a bunch of queer characters, and that's really provocative to me. Okay, let's do that as an exposure, right? Especially if it's something that's like really empowering. Read about sexuality, gender fluidity, read about these things, learn, really like educate yourself about them as an exposure. Attending an event where allies are welcome, right? So not like the support group for people of a certain identity, not like an affinity group or anything like that. Writing a script about never being able to know your gender identity or sexuality with complete certainty. This is an interesting one because I think, when we talk about uncertainty, oftentimes with OCD, it's like, hey, I'm pretty sure, but I have this kind of uncertainty around the edges. And so these scripts are about like, maybe I'm not going to get that just right feeling that I know 100% that I am of this sexuality or of this gender, and I'm willing to still live my life, right? So these are getting at a little bit more at what's important here about like intolerance of uncertainty, worries about authenticity, and really it's about getting you back to living the life that you were living without the influence of OCD kind of taking things away. Okie doke. All right. And this is, of course, this is important regardless of, if it's it's important regardless of which aspects of identity you're looking at, that you always want to have cultural humility as a therapist. So what is cultural humility? Well, it is, it's competency in the sense that you're familiar with the communities that you're working with, but humility is really taking a step back and saying, hey, I'm not in this particular community, and my client is sort of the expert on their experience, and being humble enough also to say like, hey, if I make a mistake, please call me out, or if I say something that's offensive, please call me out, so that or call me in so that I can, so that I can do better and help create a safe space for you. So doing that personal work to recognize and work to dismantle stigma about queer sex, right? Being able to talk to your clients about sex. If it's something that you're squeamish about or unfamiliar with, you don't want it to be something that, your client is talking to you and you're like, whoa, wait a second. Like, how does that, like, what are you doing in the bedroom? Number one, none of your business. And number two, like that is, that's an indication perhaps that there might be some kind of stigma there, and that people aren't going to feel safe with you. Using affirming language. So it used to be that we called sexual orientation homosexual OCD. Nobody says homosexual, I don't think. I don't know who says homosexual anymore, but it's just like not, I mean, technically, yes, like it's a term, but it's and it's could be an accurate term. But in any case, it's sort of wrong on two levels, right? Number one, homosexual just being like one version of LGBTQ, and being a sort of outdated word. And I think more importantly, well, that erases people in the queer community who are worried that they are, who have an intrusive, unwanted thought, like maybe I'm straight, right? We could have like HOCD. We could have LOCD for like lesbian OCD. We could have SOCD for straight OCD. We could have BOCD for bi OCD, right? No, that's stupid. Let's just call it sexual orientation OCD and include everyone. So again, that language has changed quite a bit. I still see it out there sometimes. But I know people are working hard to sort of recognize like, hey, this is not it anymore. Using words like transgendered instead of transgender. Talking about somebody's lifestyle is really coded, right? For like, well, it's just your lifestyle that you've chosen. So I know that's kind of like queer competency 101, but it's worth saying. Okay, this one's interesting. Avoid as a therapist, you don't want to do harmful reassurance about sexual orientation or gender, right? Think about, yeah, I know it would be really, really terrible if you were gay, and we're going to do these exposures, right? Or, it sounds like that's OCD. your OCD is saying this, that, and the other. I mean, really, we're not there to clarify sexual orientation at all or gender identity at all. We're here to help people identify the ways in which OCD is clouding this, whatever process, and then remove those compulsive and unhelpful behaviors and see whatever is left. Because I've certainly worked with some people who have identified as straight, come into therapy, and they have like these worries. Well, I'm not sure. I might be, I might be bisexual or something like that. And it's not this binary of like, well, if you have OCD, then you definitely aren't. And, sometimes it's a little bit of both. Sometimes it is, I'm doubting, I'm coming out, but I'm sort of doubting that I'm coming out. So just really treading lightly around that. And, this is a funny way to put it, but queerness is not the catastrophe to be avoided. Queerness is not the worst case scenario. This is not akin to like, when somebody's afraid, like, well, what if my loved one dies? And we're like, okay, well, worst case scenario, let's go in. This is about one's identity. And by saying, queerness is this catastrophe or this worst case scenario, what you're doing is you're really reifying these harmful beliefs. And so even if somebody comes in and they have, let's say they have some negative beliefs about people in the community, that does not mean that you as a therapist want to like sort of go along with that. I know, again, that's kind of 101, but it's so important. And then I think for therapists, just to keep it a little, just to make it real meta, how OCD is never like, it's never, there's always that little seed of doubt in there, resist the urge to this or that symptom. So for example, what I mean by this or that is like, this is all somebody's identity or it's all OCD, right? I've worked with people, for example, I do a lot of work with trans and gender nonconforming youth, which is very interesting in a state that has, banned gender affirming care for youth. But people can have, for example, like a gender related compulsion. Like I worked with a little one who had magical thinking rituals that she felt if she did these kinds of like thought the right thing, then people wouldn't misgender her and call her a boy. And so, yeah, she had those and they were around gender, but it didn't like undo her gender identity, right? Like she's, so I hope that makes sense. That's a kind of an interesting example, but I think sometimes people are like, well, I think I even did a presentation once where our title was something like, is it OCD or could I be queer? And the answer was like, yeah, all of it could anything, like it could be any of this. And we were like, we got you in here with a clickbait title. And now, we're gonna talk about how incredibly nuanced it is. Okay. Finding care. So for those of you who are maybe attending this and are somebody in the community with lived experience, and you're like, when are you going to talk to me? Now, sorry, it took so long, but now we're going to talk about finding care. As I was saying before, and this is finding care, but this is also, I think, like hints for therapists who want to be more affirming as well. Conversion therapy is still legal in many states. Does anybody know how many states actually have legal protection against conversion therapy? I don't even know if I can get to the chat. Whoops, that wasn't what I wanted to do. I was gonna have people like say, but I can't look at the chat. So can y'all put, if you think you know, in the chat, and then Ben will tell me what it says, because he can probably still see it, because he's magical. Are there any guesses, or is everybody like, oh, I don't know? Oh, I can see the chat. Somebody said, that is right. Micah, not enough. I know. Look, I'm going to add a reaction too. Love. Yeah, absolutely not enough. 23 states have protections against conversion therapy is illegal in 23 states. Okay, so the rest, there's some that are ambiguous. And then there's some like the state of Tennessee where like it's legal. I practice in Well, one of the locations of our clinic is in a county, Williamson County, that has like right down, like the next town over has a practice that's doing sort of like, you know, biblical based, like, let's you know, let's help your kiddo not be queer anymore therapy. So yeah, it behooves people to really look into like who's providing this care. So look for providers who mention working with the community on their websites. Are they talking about, you know, this is a population with whom I work? Are there indications on the website of, you know, it could be like pride flags. It could also be things like, you know, we serve people of all different genders and sexual orientations, et cetera. Certain websites that have that will list providers or clinics are affirming. So there's the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. There's Therapy Den, which kind of has that's one of their values, is being affirming. And then there are others. So in particular, when we're looking at OCD, the IOCDF, if you go to their website and you go to like find help or find a provider, I don't remember what it says, you can click, there are sort of filters. And so you can click people who say that they're LGBTQIA affirming. Obviously, anybody can put that on their profile. You'd still want to do a little bit more work. Psychology Today also has similar filters. And then, you know, I'm a big fan of also like asking questions to assess not only for OCD competency, which is, we know that's hard enough, finding people who do evidence-based treatment for OCD, but also competency and humility in working with the community. So do you use evidence-based treatment for OCD? Which modalities? How do you alter therapy for queer clients, if at all? Or maybe like what kinds of things do you consider when you're working with queer clients? You can ask what percentage of your clientele are part of the community, right? Is this something that you're working with on the regular? Would this be kind of new? Are you familiar with the current legislation affecting my community? I love this question. It's very telling, because the last thing that, you know, that you want to be doing is sort of educating somebody about like, well, you know, you're saying I should do this exposure. And if I do this, you know, or you know, there are states now where gender markers, you can't get your gender markers changed on things like driver's licenses, things like that. It's just really important to know these kinds of things before you're asking somebody to do an exposure that might be unsafe, harmful, or illegal, right? Okie doke. So also for like your sort of intake forms or your assessment forms, looking for language on any forms, if there are forms to fill out on a website, or if you're a therapist thinking about this, making sure that your intake forms allow for somebody to self-identify, you know, not just having, male, female, trans, other, or whatever, and then just kind of maybe having a free response or things like that. Heteronormative language, I will say, when I opened up my our clinic about 6.5 years ago, I just sort of took somebody else's intake form and I was like, yeah, you know, why reinvent the wheel? And I was mortified because it had on our kids' intake form, it had a spot for like mother's name, father's name, and like, and then I mean, a couple kind of turned in their forms. The parent had like crossed out, had printed it out and crossed it out and said like parent and parent, or, you know, mom and mom, dad and dad. I can't. And so, you know, just looking, it's so natural for us to, you know, want to cut corners there, but really thinking about that, having, you know, asking people about their name, legal name, if needed, telling people, hey, I will have to use your legal name if I'm like filing for insurance claims, things like that. And not using phrasing like preferred name. So somebody's name is their name. You know, intake and assessment, asking about pronouns. Also, I would say for folks who are looking for affirming therapists, having pronouns on your, therapist pronouns on your website goes a long way. I know that at our clinic, we've had some people who have called to tell us that they will not be coming to our clinic because we have pronouns on our website. And I'm like, I don't actually field those calls, but I've talked to administrative staff about like what to say there, just to be really, okay. Thank you for letting us know. I don't know. But just be kind and get off the phone. Yeah, and free responses, like I said. And then finally, for people with OCD, being honest with yourself about intentions. A lot of times, and everybody reserves the right to find a therapist who's going to understand their experience. I have at times been like, I want to see a queer therapist. That's something that is important to me in my identity. And really, if you're going for OCD treatment, is this due to that sort of comfort or being, having somebody who understands you? Or is it, I know this is maybe a little controversial, but is there a little bit of like a just right concern? Like I need to find the perfect therapist. If you're working with OCD, there are people in and outside of the community who can be quite affirming. And then affirming doesn't mean endlessly accommodating, right? If somebody's affirming of your gender identity or your sexual orientation, it does not mean that that there's going to be that therapy is going to be like it's not going to be hard. Like OCD therapy that's effective is difficult. It's asking you to choose behaviors that have felt dangerous or scary. And so sometimes I only put that on there because I think sometimes it can get a little bit twisted that like being affirming of one's identity doesn't mean sort of like, all right, well, we're not going to do anything difficult. And I only put that on there because I've had a handful of times that something like that has come up. Where am I on time? Well, this is good timing because I am ready for questions.